Thank you very much. I must first apologize because I'm one of the few who hasn't prepared a paper on occasion of this conference. It has many reasons. One of the reasons is that the data is pretty fresh and it took us quite some time to get it. I can immediately follow up on Hans-Peter's presentation this morning. What I'm doing in the next 20 minutes is, in a way, a country case study in the broader context of the transformation of European party systems as outlined by Hans-Peter. In the research we did in the past 15 years, I think now, we observed the emergence of a new demarcation integration cleavage, and we showed that this new cleavage has been producing a new party family, which we called radical, not only we, but which the scholarly literature called radical right populist parties, although Yves this morning quite rightly mentioned that these labels are probably not too useful in order to understand what's going on. And we argued in our first book that the consequence of this change, the rise of a new party family, would be a fragmentation and polarization of national party systems. And in most of the cases, we were able to show this quite convincingly. In the first book, there were two exceptions, the most notable Germany, and Martin Dolezar's chapter in this book had the title, "The Dog That Didn't Bark." What was the reason for German exceptionalism? Germany was one of the two countries and one of the few in Northwest European countries in which a radical populist right party didn't make it to enter the national parliament. And this was not due to the fact that the new demarcation integration cleavage didn't exist in Germany at that time. We were able to show that the issues which have been constitutive for this issue have been relevant in Germany as well. And even more, we know that there have been several radical right, extreme right parties at regional level since the 1990s. The DVU, the German People's Union, and others. So it seems as if the political potentials for the establishment of such a party has been there since the late 1980s, early 1990s, but for whatever reason, this potential has not been exploited in the same way as it has been done in other European countries. One of the arguments we suggested in this book was that moderate right parties, the Christian democratic parties, on some occasions served as functional equivalents. The debate on Turkey's EU membership was such an example where the Christian democratic parties can be found exactly at the same place in the political space as we find the Freedom Party in Austria. So this was one argument, but this was evidently the success of a radical populist right party in Germany was contingent on several conditions. And we should also consider, as for example Thomas Pogunte has shown in a recent article, that the German party system has been in flux since at least the 1990s. So it was not just the changes we've been analyzing. There has been a long-term trend in the decline of catch-all parties. There has been an increasing volatility of voters. So the German party system has been in flux since the 1990s. A new cleavage has been emerging, but the potentials have not been fully used. And now the question is whether and how the more recent crisis would make a difference. And as we've shown elsewhere, amazingly, the euro crisis has not made that difference. The political consequences of the euro crisis have been rather moderate compared to other countries, as shown by Sven and others. But the interesting question is whether the refugee crisis would make such a difference, and this is what I will show in the following. To put the argument in context, it's useful to go back to summer 2017 and the public and the scholarly debate on the election outcomes in Germany. At that time, and Kotte summarized this conventional wisdom quite nicely. At that time, the expectation was that the mainstream parties would dominate the election campaign, and that competition between the mainstream party would be a centripetal competition. Kotte called this the return of the center. Not the fleeing of the center, but the return of the center. Die Rückkehr der Mitte. And this return of the center was attributed to the increasing importance of welfare issues, social security, in the election campaign. Social justice was the main electoral slogan of the Social Democratic Party in this campaign. The consequence should be a marginalization of all smaller parties, and in particular of, as they were called in the German debate, protest parties such as the AfD. These parties were supposed to lose in importance, and there were even doubts whether they would make it into the national parliament. In early summer 2000, opinion polls showed 5% of votes for these parties. So this was the scenery in early summer, summer 2015. These were the scholarly expectations, and these were the main results, and they were quite frustrating for the scholarly community, because first, dramatic losses of both mainstream parties. They showed the lowest results since the 1950s. The CDU lost almost 10% in votes, the Social Democrats 5% from a much lower level. In some, the two governing parties lost almost 14% of their votes. We had a remarkable comeback of the Liberal Party with more than 10%, and of course, in a German perspective, a quite spectacular success of a new radical populist right party with 12.6%. These developments, compared to the recent Italian elections, these results look like nothing, but from a German perspective, they signify a quite substantial change in the German party system. And the question is, how can we explain this, and how does the refugee crisis contribute to these developments? I will not talk about the data and the research methods, because Hans-Peter has done this this morning, and it's more or less the same data except for the data we take from the German election study, but the rest of, in particular, the analysis of the supply side of election campaigns is as usually done by quantitative content analysis. And I will now show first for the demand side, that is voter perceptions, and on the other hand, on the supply side, that is the positioning, the emphasis parties gave to the various issues, the positioning of the parties towards these issues, how politicization in the last German election actually worked out. What was the most important problem for voters in 2017? It was immigration. And I will show this in 3 steps. First, you see the relative importance of immigration compared to all other issues. And you see it's by far the most important issue for voters. And this has been so since summer 2015, since the outbreak of the refugee crisis. This holds for the the voters of every party except for the radical left. You see, it's most evident for the voters of the AfD, the radical populists, but it also holds for the voters of the liberals and the Christian Democrats. And even for social democratic voters, immigration was more important than welfare issues. And third, this was so for the entire phase of the election campaign. This trend lines show you the last 2 months of the election campaigns from the end of July until the election day. And the blue line are the results for immigration, and you clearly see that except for the last few days of the election campaign, immigration was the dominant issue. We also see that economic issues, that welfare has been an important issue in this debate, and we see that environmental issues have been quite important in this election. But evidently, immigration in this election campaign, immigration was the elephant in the room, I can't show this in detail, but I think it is important to consider, before we look at the supply side in more detail, at the strategy of mainstream parties. And our data show that the mainstream parties dominate the election campaign. And they try to respond to the immigration issue in more or less the same way as they responded to the European issue in 2013. That is, they tried to avoid this issue. This was quite consistently so, and both mainstream parties emphasized socio-economic issues instead. The very idea was to address the so-called economic losers of globalization in this way. And we can also see that both mainstream parties converged on socio-economic issues. That is, the differences between the two parties, the positioning of these issues was quite low. And this picture, in a way, summarizes the election campaign of the Christian Democratic Party. Very much focused on the Chancellor with a admirably trivial slogan. But this was the basic message of mainstream parties in this campaign. So now, what did they do in more detail? If we look at the salience of issues in the election campaign, it again was immigration, and we can. I will show. We can see that immigration. We'll show this in more detail. Immigration was clearly the most salient issue in the campaign. That is, mainstream parties tried to avoid the issues, but they didn't make it to avoid the issue. This is important. Later on, they complained about the media, that the media forced them into this debate. And we can clearly see that immigration, how immigration how the importance of immigration, the salience of immigration, has been increasing over time. It's in fact, let me show you the data first. This is salience by issue. In our data, immigration, almost 20% of all extra issue sentences are in immigration. It was the most salient issue in this debate. These were the issue categories introduced by Hans-Peter this morning already. And you see here the salience of immigration in all German elections since the 1990s. In a comparative perspective, it is important to mention that it has not been a highly politicized issue in German elections compared to other countries, France, Switzerland, and so on. But it had some politicizing potential. What you see here is the strong increase between 2013 and 2017, and we had a look in our data, and I think there is no other issue in no other election in which we find such a strong increase in salience as with immigration in this election. As a consequence, the new cultural issues, that is immigration, Europe, cultural liberalism, became more important in this election campaign than economic issues. This is even so after recoding the cultural issues. Sven has recoded the cultural issues. This figure is not identical to the one shown by us in earlier publications. The share of cultural issues is lower because we excluded issues which are related to defense. Which means that this category has been gaining in importance. But even more important, immigration has not only been highly salient, it has also been strongly polarizing. It is the most polarizing issue in this campaign. In the 2013 election campaign, we found no issue which was both salient and polarizing. In the diagram, this space was empty. You had issues such as welfare, which were salient but not polarizing, and you had a few issues which were in some way polarizing but not salient. Immigration was among them in 2013. The 2017 election is completely different in this regard. This was an election which really had the big issue, an issue which was both salient and polarizing. Okay, this will be tough, but I'll do my best. First, on polarization, you here see the party positions on immigration in this campaign. It's and we also distinguish between the CDU and the CSU because in the 2 years after the refugee crisis, the CSU was much more critical. We had this conflict between Merkel and Seehofer. They were much more critical, so we thought there is a difference between the two. It makes sense to distinguish the two, and you clearly see there is. So you had. And it's also important when it comes to coalition bargaining, things like this, that the liberals on this issue took a rather critical position. So it's not the same FDP that disappeared in 2013. In some way, it's a new beast. And immigration is one of the issues where you can see this, but you can clearly see the polarization between the AfD on the one hand, the Greens and the Left Party on the other hand. This shows you the politicization of the issue. You had on the left Yes, on the left-hand side, you find, again, salience. In the middle, you have polarization. You see, immigration is by far the most polarizing issue. Defense is also polarizing because defense includes foreign and defense issues related to the civic war in Syria, the conflict with Turkey, and things like this. So issues, foreign policy issues, security issues, closely related to immigration. Cultural liberalism is also polarizing, and you see that's important. Welfare is not polarizing and not politicizing. And now, Catherine, I think this makes you happy. This is the answer to the question, who was the issue entrepreneur in this election campaign, who tried to exploit the issue. And as we all would expect, it was the radical right. And we calculated issue entrepreneurship as you suggest. The radical right clearly was the issue entrepreneur in this debate. They tried most strategically to exploit this new this political potential, and this is the figure already shown by Hans-Peter. This is the result, the structure of the political space in the 2017 election in comparison to 2013. And what is most important here, of course, is that the cultural dimension is the one which really stretches the political space, and that you find the AfD exactly where you would expect a radical populist right party in a two-dimensional political space, in which the second dimension is constituted by new cultural issues such as Europe and immigration. So finally, the dog is barking in Germany as well, and. Just to conclude, first, the potential for structural change has been existing since the 1990s. This is important when it comes to the question whether the success of the AfD would be just a singular event, or whether it signifies a structural change in the party system. In my interpretation, the refugee crisis served as a critical event in more or less the same way as, for example, Chernobyl in 1986 was a critical event for the future success of the Green Party in Germany. The party existed before. Chernobyl was not causal for its existence, but it made a real difference for its future success and development. Immigration immigration was the dominant issue in this campaign, both for voters and for the parties. And finally, it was a radical right challenger party, and how radical and how right it actually has been, we will hear later on, which in my interpretation has been able to fill what has been called the populist gap in the German party system. And the result, in my understanding, is a new German party system. Okay, thanks.